speaker on the titanium-based ceramics. This picture is a picture of the 3D printing process they used in this paper. It's an aerosol-based printer. So in the big box with the little one, that's your polymer titania composite liquid, and they just use a high-pressure gas to aerosolize it. So it's then carried through two, which is just a pipe, and it's transferred to a nozzle, and then a second gas focuses it and pressurizes it so that it deposits on the surface. So the title of the paper I read was Enhanced Biological and Mechanical Properties of Well-Dispersed Nanophase Ceramics and Polymer Composites from 2D to 3D Printed Structures. In the Materials Science and Engineering Journal. And the scope of the study was to investigate the properties of nanophase ceramic polymer composites, and they used the aerosol 3D printing process, and they were really interested in the mechanical and bio properties of this material. So their approach, they used PLGA as a control, so we saw that when we were talking about the plastics. And then STC is sintered titania compacts was another control, so it's just the ceramic by itself. They sintered it at 600 degrees Celsius for 2 hours. And then NTPC is short for nano titania PLGA composites. And they have two different versions of it. So the first is agglomerated and the second is dispersed. And the difference between those two is how they mix the titania particles. So they used an ultrasound or sonication process to mix them, and at a lower power they got the agglomerated particles, so they just clumped together, and at a higher power they got the dispersed particles. So they wanted to compare the two and see which one was better. The process conditions, they did in vitro osteoblast performance. They also did surface roughness measurements and strength testing. For the strength testing, they didn't use the 3D printed parts because those are on the micron scale, but they did use the same material, so they cast it rather than 3D printing. And then they used an M3 DTM ultrasonic atomizer. That's the printer process. And then they added an instrument mechanical tester and lots and lots of imaging software. So they use AFM, SEM, lots of different types. So this picture here is an image of the printer. You can see the magnified nozzle that's a 100 micron, that green bar. So it's printing very, very small structures. Okay, so the first thing that we're going to talk about, there's a lot of studies in this one paper, so we're just going to focus on the mechanical ones. It says, how does the surface roughness of the composites compare to the controls and bone? Because that was the ultimate purpose, was replacing bone structures or having a graft or something like that. So these four pictures compare the PLGA and STC, which are the controls on the left, to the two composites. So the top right is the agglomerated composite, and the bottom right is the dispersed. You can see the STC, which is the standard ceramic, is very, very rough, and PLGA is smooth, and the agglomerated and dispersed are somewhere in between. And the next slide shows another comparison to bone. But the main conclusion was that the dispersed composite, so they had higher mixing power, had a closer surface roughness to the bone, which is the goal of the study. And this is that comparison. So the top left is the agglomerated, and the top right is the dispersed, and then the bottom are two images of bone, and they're all at the same scale. So you can see that the outer surface is fairly rough, and the agglomerated NTPC was quite smooth. So they wanted a little bit rougher surface, and they chose the dispersed. In the paper, they also showed the standard ceramic by itself, and it was far rougher than the bone surface, so that wasn't as desirable. The second study that we'll look at is how does the tensile strength of the composites compare to the controls. So like I said, they didn't do 3D printed samples, they cast some tensile bars and tested them on the Instron. You can see on the right just sheer numbers of tensile modulus. The dispersed nanoparticles had a far better structural strength, and then their stress strain curves are on the left there. So the control PLGA, it's not weak, but it could be stronger, especially for bone grafts. And that was the goal, was to mix in these nanoparticles. And the dispersed had a more uniform, and it was a better performance. So the composite with the dispersed nanotitania had higher tensile strength than the agglomerated or the base PLGA. Some of the other just key conclusions from the research paper. So the dispersed composite was more closely mimicking the surface roughness of bone than the PLGA, the NTPC-A, which is the agglomerated, or just the standard titania. And then it also had higher mechanical properties than PLGA and the agglomerated composite. It also demonstrated better bone cell functions than either of them. So one of the other studies was they showed how do the osteoblasts adhere to it and grow, and it actually performed quite well. And it also helped to counteract acidic effects of degrading PLGA. So because PLGA is biocompatible, it also degrades in the body, which is sometimes desired. However, one side effect is it can reduce the pH in that zone, and the titania nanoparticles help to combat that, so it wasn't as harmful. Personal critique, I thought it was well-rounded research. They did multiple samples on everything, and they explained every single step of their process. It was very, very detailed.